Welcome to the solution video for the truck rental challenge. Let's go ahead and get started with our console application. We'll call this our truck rental challenge, and we'll call this truck rental challenge solution. And the first thing we do once this loads up is we'll add our console read line at the end. That way we have the ability to stop our application and see what's going on. So now let's talk through what we need to do. We need to calculate the cost to rent a truck. And there's a few things that go into that calculation, and it gets a little more complex as we progress. So let's plan out now what some of those complexities are and what things we need to look out for. Let's go start by, I'm going to put right in my main method, I was going to put some comments. So truck rental, we have an amount for the first time block, which for the general challenge, the normal challenge, that is $25 for the first hour. So $25 for the first hour. But later it's going to be $5 or $5 for the first 20 minutes. So the idea is the same. It's a set amount, which is lower than normal, for a set amount of time. The first set. After that, the normal rates apply. So we have an hourly rate, which for right now is $50 an hour. And we have a daily rate for weekdays of $400. And we have a daily rate for weekends of $200. That way, everything inside it will be static. We have to mark it as static, but that way we know we don't accidentally put something in here that's not static, and no one's instantiating this. Public static, let's say int, and this is going to be represent the first hour or the first 20 minutes, which means we should represent it in minutes. So, let's call this the discount start minutes. And we're going to set that equal to 60 at first. We got 60 minutes is 1 hour. So that's what we're going to start with this $25 for the first hour. And then we'll say public static decimal. Decimal stores money. And this is the discounted start price. And that's $25, which we have to put a capital M at the end to say, yes, this is decimal, not double, or in this case, integer. But it would assume it is double, not decimal. So that just tells us for sure. Okay, so now we have those two represented. Now we need the hourly rate, public static decimal hourly rate, and that is $50 per hour. We need the public static decimal daily weekday rate. That's $400. And public static decimal daily weekend rate equals 200. So that represents all of our data we have here, except for the change to 20 minutes and $5, but that's just changing these values. Now I said this as a simulation because the reality is I would want to pull these from a database and store them once and have it be a singleton, not a static class. And so I'd load this at the beginning of my application startup and populate these values. That way, when management came to me and said, change that one value to $5 for every 20 minutes, I would just change 60 to 20 and 25 to 5 in the database. And next time an application loaded, it would get the new values. This way, we could also change things like how much is the daily rate on weekdays, on weekends, how much is the hourly rate, because these things will change, just not very often. Therefore, I want them in the database, but once I load them once in my application, I'm not this challenge. The challenge is focused on the logic of how do we use this information, not how do we create it. Therefore, I'm not going to spend a lot of time creating a full ecosystem for this. Okay, I'm going to leave it here, this class, so I can see it in my main and in my other method I'm going to create now. Eventually, I would like to move this over into its own class file, and I'll probably do that if I remember. And that is the danger of putting your classes in another class file, is you forget to do it later. Okay, so let's create a method that is private static, and we need to return, let's return the amount they owe, which would be a decimal. Calculate amount owed. They could say calculate amount owed for rental or for truck rental, but I think this is clear enough. We're going to pass in a date time, the start date, a date time for the end date, which really should be right now, whenever it's running. But I'm trying to debate. We might just take it off because of that. But I think I'm going to pass it in just to have the flexibility later to say, oh no, they returned it yesterday and it's all good. But we won't mess around with that. We'll just put in right now. Okay, so start date, end date. That'll also make it easier for testing because I can give it the same start date and end date and make sure I get the same results even after I make changes to it. So if I always use now, then what happens is I might not get the same date all the time. It's going to be a moving target, and that is hard on testing. So start date and end date is really all we need to know how much to charge them. So let's leave it at that. And we'll need a decimal output equals 0. I don't have to put the M at the end of a 0 because that works for double, decimal, and integer. That satisfies the method, so I don't have the red squiggles anymore. But just be careful that you don't forget then to put your logic in between these two lines. So let's start walking through this. Let's start by working on the time block for the first time block, okay, which is right now for the first hour, but we'll get there in a minute. So let's start by calculating the total number of minutes that a person, total time that a person has rented this vehicle. So time span, rental time, equals end date subtract start date. And that gives us a time span. And this time span will allow us to identify the time between two date times. Now with that, we can say things like rental time dot, we can grab the seconds, the minutes, the hours, the total, or the days. So we can say, is it days greater than 1? Then we know that yes, it's farther along than 1. But let's look at minutes and see if the minutes exceeds our discounted start minutes. Okay, so I'm going to cut this out. There we go. If the minutes is less than or equal to pricing dot discounted start minutes. So if it's less than or equal to, that means that we're still in that first rental window, which is that first cheaper period. Therefore, we're going to return that cheaper amount. So we can say output equals pricing dot discount start price. And we're done. And now when we return, we'll return that value. Okay, so let's make sure that works first. So we're going to create a date time start and equals date time dot, let's go to new date time. New date time. We have a few options here based off ticks. No, we're not going to do that. Kind, year, month, day, and the calendar type. And this is the one we're going to use, year, month, day, hour, minute, second. So let's say 2019. The month is, let's go with 3. The day, let's go 15. And the hour is, 13. And the minute is 11. Let's go minute 21. And the second is, let's just say 00. That's fine. Or 0. So that's our start time. Now you can copy this and say end. And we'll say that they returned it on, let's go with, you know what? They were really quick and returned it on 37, which is only 16 minutes difference. Let's capture the result. Calculate amount owed. Start, end. And then we'll do a right line that says you owe amount owed and call it good. And what we'll do here is we'll actually say colon capital C which will allow us, well, once I do it right, there we go. It will allow us to format this as a currency. You can't have any spaces afterwards. That's why it yelled at me. I prefer to have spaces around it. It says, no, you can't do that when you're using the formatter. So colon capital C will format as a currency. Let's run this. And it says you owe $25. Excellent. That's exactly what we expected. So it's calculating correctly with the correct information. So now let's move on to the more complex areas. So else, we can do an else if, or we can just do an else. I think we'll do an else if. So else if, what I'm going to do is determine if the number of minutes is less than the time it will take to get to our daily rate. So I think this requires a separate method to do one thing. And that one thing, private static decimal, is to identify the rate for a given day. So you pass in a day and it tells you what the rate for that day is. So we're going to say, let's create a decimal output equals, let's start off with the daily weekday rate. So daily weekday rate, because that's the most common. But then say if day of week equals Saturday, or day of week equals Sunday, then set the output equal to pricing.daily weekend rates. And then either way, we will return output. So by passing in a day, you get back how much money they'll owe us that particular day. This is going to come in handy in a couple different ways, but we'll start with just this. So we can say if, and we'll do a calculation right inside of our if statement. So we're going to calculate we already have the number of minutes with the rental time. So you can say if the number of minutes, rental time dot minutes, oops, not minutes, hours. Makes it easier. If the hours is times, we need the hourly rate. So pricing dot hourly rate. If that calculation is less than the identified daily rate for start date, so this one's for just the first cheaper period. This one down here is for the hourly rate. And we need to add in actually we need to subtract 1. So that is something we have to take care of. I'm going to move this if inside the else, because we do need to subtract 1 because we have, or subtract some time for the rental minutes. So now it's getting more complicated. Let's cut this out here. And I'll paste it down below and comment it out. Just so I have the logic, but I'm going to wait on this because I'm going to calculate how much the actual cost is going to be by taking the rental hours. I'm going to do minutes instead now because I have to deal with the idea of the number of minutes for the starting discounted price. I can't always guarantee it's 1 hour. So let's change this. I'm going to comment this out too. When you have code that's kind of right, but not really, instead of trying to fight with it, comment it out and then use it as a reference for creating the rest of your code. I'm going to say decimal cost so far, or hourly cost for rental. Let's go calculated. Naming's hard. Calculated hourly Let's actually hit a line break here. Pricing dot the discounted start minutes. So we're going to subtract those start minutes from the overall minutes. And then we're going to multiply that whole thing. So let's put this in another set of parens. So we're just making sure that we're doing it right. Multiply that by 60. And then we're going to need to multiply that by, divide by 60. Wow, I almost really charged people. Divide by 60 because now that's hours. And now what we'll need to do is we'll need to then multiply that number by our rate. So identify daily rate for start date, like so. And the one thing we also need to do with this division here is I want to wrap this whole thing. So I'm going to cut it in a math.ceil or ceiling. And what that'll do is it will ensure that we get back a decimal value. Well, in this case, it's ambiguous. So we got to take care of that. But it's going to make sure you get the upper value. We always round up in hours. So if you rented for 2.5 hours, well, you're into the next hour. Therefore, it's 3 hours. We want to make sure we actually charge them for that. All right, so it's telling us that ceiling multiplying by the daily rate, you'd think at first we want decimals to all be consistent. But we're multiplying the daily rate, which is a dollar amount, not by another dollar amount. You can't multiply dollars together. You multiply dollars by usually integers. So in this case, 3 hours is a whole number integer that I'll multiply by the daily rate of, let's say, $400 a day. So, which actually is not hours. It would be, anyways. Well, actually, that does indicate that I did have the wrong value here. It's not the daily rate. It's actually the pricing dot, and this is the hourly rate, because we're calculating the hourly cost. But the point still holds that we can't use ceiling where we don't know what the output is and want the output to actually be an integer. So the first fix is to make it a double internally. But then it yells us even more. And this is where one of those debugging things where it actually is a good thing that it yells at us more because it's actually the next error. So don't get frustrated when it causes another error. Sometimes fixing one error causes the next error. It doesn't mean you undo the fix you just did. It means that you continue to debug. Address each error on its own. In this case, I actually want to cast my math.ceiling to an integer. Doing so allows me to then multiply by my hourly rate. So now I have the discounted start price. That means I have 2 hours times the hourly rate of $50 an hour, which equals $100, which added to my $25 equals my total of $125. That's what the calculation should come up with. We'll verify that by actually running this same calculation, 3 hours difference. So now that we have the hourly cost, then what we do is we do our if statement. So we say if our calculated total cost by hourly is less than or equal to is fine, the identified daily rate for the start date, then we say output equals calculated total cost by hourly. Now we can test this out. So let's change our minutes back to be equal. So start time and end time are now equal. We're going to change this by 3 hours. So it's now 16. And let's run this. It should be $125. And it says, nope, you owe $25. So that's not right. Let's find out why. Let's put a breakpoint here and start it over again. And let's look at our rental time in minutes. And whoops, it has 0 minutes. Well, that's not right. We need the total minutes, which is 180. So that's why we messed up here. So if total minutes is what we want, And let's make sure that we're not, right down here we said minutes again, so total minutes is what we're looking for. And just make sure we're not using that anywhere else. I don't think we are, but it's important to try these different things out and make sure that we don't have some kind of bug like we just saw. And we didn't use it down here either. Okay, so now let's try it again. And now it says we owe $125. This is why you should know the output before it comes on the screen. Otherwise, you might say, yep, that sounds right, when it's not. All right, so now we have if the first cheaper period applies or if the hourly rate applies. Now let's look at the rate if the hourly rate does not apply, if it's over that amount. So let's figure out this logic. Let's, again, write it down so we can kind of visualize it before we start typing out code. And this kind of comes back to the idea of plan before you build. It's important even down to the method level and below. Now, sometimes they do it in our head, but the reality is I want you to think through before you just start typing. Otherwise, you type yourself into a corner or make silly mistakes like I was going to do where I was using this identified daily rate to calculate the hourly rate, which is just silly. So let's talk through the logic for using the daily rate. We need to identify the number of days. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, we already have the rental time, which if we look at the rental time, we have our total days, which total days is a double, which that's a fractional day. I don't want that. But we also have our days. And days is going to be the whole number that says this is the number of days that it was. We can use that. But one of the things that it's not really written in the specifications, and this is one of those things that you have to get used to, is the idea that you don't get the whole picture all the time when you get specifications for a job. It's not really in the specification what happens if I rent it at, let's say, 4 p.m. on Monday, and I return it at 11 a.m. on Tuesday. You'd think that's one day, right? But what if I rent it at 4 p.m. on Monday and return it at 10 p.m. on Tuesday? Is that one day? Probably not. In fact, let's make it even more extreme. What if I came in first thing 8 a.m. on Monday morning and rented this truck, and I didn't return it until 11:59 on Tuesday, 11:59 p.m. So that'd be 2,300 hours, 23:59. Is that one day or is that two? Well, it's probably 2 days. Now, we weren't told that in the requirements. We have to kind of figure that out on our own. I'm going to say that noon is the cutoff. So what that means is if the end date is going to be greater, the time is going to be greater than noon, greater than 12, then I am going to assess an extra day. Okay. So if the hour is 12 or later, so we're at or after the 12th hour. So if the hour is 12 or later, I'm going to add one extra day on. So let's start with that. So we're going to say int total rental days equals, let's start with our rental time dot days, and then say if the end date, so end date dot hour, and this is the hour which is represented by the 0 through 23. So greater than or equal to 12. Then total rental days plus equal 1. So add 1 to the rental days. Now we have the days that we're renting this. So what does that allow us to do? What we can do a for loop. We're going to say I is actually equal to 1, so I'll do that in a minute, but total rental days. So I equals 1 and total rental days less than, or you know what, let's say it's 0. That's fine. We won't actually use I. What I'm going to do is I am going to create outside here, I'm going to create a decimal that is the calculated daily price. It's going to set equal to 0 to start. And then for every day, I'm going to assess the daily rate for that day. And you know what? I am going to use that I after all. So let's set it to be 1 and less than or equal to. Nope, still going to need 0. Change my mind. So here's why. I need to put this logic down on paper and then we'll look at it and see if we need to change I or not. That's probably a better option. So what I'll do is I will say total rental, not days, it's calculated daily price plus equals the identified daily rate for the start date, add days, I. Now, so the I is going to be 0. That's fine because we're going to start off with don't add any days, just give a start date. And then 1 day beyond, what's that rate? And 1 day beyond until we've gone through all the total rental days. Okay, so starting at 0, we can go less than total rental days. That's going to add the daily rate to our calculated daily price. Now, because we're doing daily pricing, we don't have to worry about that initial start period or the hourly rates for the first day. It's all just daily rate now. So now, once we run through that loop, we should be able to say output equals calculated daily price. And then return output. Let's check this out. So we have our 3-hour difference. Now let's change our day difference to be 1. So we need 1 day and 3 hours. But notice that the hours is 16, which is 4 p.m., which is well past noon. Let's see what happens. It should be that it's 2 days. And I'm not even sure what March 15th is. Let me look that up. March 15th is a Friday, which means that March 16th is a Saturday. So it should be that we get assessed a Friday rate and a Saturday rate. Total $600. Let's run this. And it says you owe $600. Excellent. Let's change that time to be 11 a.m., which means just $400 because we returned it within that 1 day period. And it says you owe $0. That's awesome. Let's find out why we owe $0. My guess, it has to do with rounding of days. So let's scroll down here and look at our days. And you know what? We're going to put a breakpoint right here and run this and see what we get. The rental days is 0. So if I look at the rental time, it's 22 hours, but it's not a full day yet. Whereas if we look at total days, it's 0.91. So the question is, do we round up to the next day? Do we do a math.ceiling where we say, well, anything that is, cast it to int, math.ceiling, and pass in our value, and that should give us our correct information. Let's run it again, and we now owe $400. Let's check it again in different situations. So put it to $1,700. That should be $600. And it says, no, you owe $800. So that's not right. So it's changed our logic, but it's caused some other problems too. And this is where it gets tricky. So we got to figure it out and figure out why it's not doing what it should. I think this might be a little too aggressive. So we're going to find out, maybe instead of doing a math.ceiling, we should just round up, as in we add 1 day to the number. But maybe not. I think the answer here is we're going about this the wrong way. What I mean by that is we're using our total days, which isn't really the number we're looking for. The number we're looking for is date days, meaning if we rented the truck on March 15th and we returned it on March 16th, we're looking for 1 day, meaning 16 minus 15 is 1. Our problem is that this rental time fact start date dot date. So that's just the date portions. That will give us whole days. Now we can get rid of the math.ceiling and all the rest, and we can use total days or we can use days. It doesn't really matter. So in this case, we're going to use days just to be clear and not have to cast. So now that's going to return the days difference between these two dates. Let's run it again. We're back to owing $600. Let's come back up here to our time and change this to 11 again, which should mean we owe $400. And we do. So now we're back on track with where we want to be. If I say, you know what? I'm going to rent this until the 22nd, and it's still 11 a.m., so I'm going to return it in enough time for that last day. And it says you owe $2,400. Sounds like maybe you should have bought your own truck. But that now calculates correctly for both weekdays and weekends, and it calculates for the rounded amounts, whether it be 11, or if I change this to 12, instead of 2,400, it's going to be 2,800 because that last day is a Friday. Therefore, it's a $400 day. So that, after a lot of kind of reworking and playing and tweaking the formula, that is how you accomplish the truck rental challenge and do it in a way that's also kind of extensible. Now, it's not crazy extensible. Like, you couldn't say, well, let's change it so that, Wednesdays are a different price. But that's really kind of outside the scope of what our original plan was. We want to make it extensible, but not over-engineer it to the point where it's really complicated to do a simple task. So this is kind of balance between the two. We can change the amount for the first hour, and we can change the first hour to be the first 20 minutes. In fact, let's do that. So we can come down here and say, oh, it's $5 for the first 20 minutes. Let's come back up here because it won't change when we still have this many days in between. But the 15th, we're checking it back in at, let's go 13 and we'll change it to 40, which is 19 minutes apart. So it should be that it costs us $5 to rent that truck, which seems pretty reasonable. So that extensibility could have been in the database where that gets loaded and now all of a sudden our application changes. We can also change our hourly rate, our weekday rate, and our weekend rate, and it will just work. Okay? So that's the solution. I hope that it was informative. I hope that you follow along and hopefully even you made some better choices than I did initially. All right. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.